Sophia never paid much attention to Uncle Robert. To the family, he was the odd one out, always wrapped up in strange business ventures, reclusive and distrustful of everyone. When she got the news that she was the sole heir to the small pawn shop he owned in downtown Chicago, she was more confused than anything. Why her? They were never close. Conversations between them had been brief, awkward exchanges at family gatherings. The shop, Robert's Emporium, was old, run down, barely making any money. Selling it seemed like the obvious choice. But something felt off. The numbers in the financial records didn't add up. The revenue was pitiful, yet there were deposits that made no sense. And then there was that back office. Always locked. No one was ever allowed inside. Curiosity gnawed at her. Why had a man she barely knew left everything to her? Why did no one in the family really understand what he did for a living? His entire life felt like a question mark. That night, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right, she grabbed a crowbar and forced open the office door. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the empty shop. The musty smell of old paper and dust filled the air. But what caught her attention most was the bookshelf in the corner. It looked old, but something about it seemed off, as if it had been moved recently. She gave it a hard shove. It slid, revealing a narrow entrance. And what she saw inside made her stomach turn. Boxes stacked high. With documents, old passports, newspaper clippings about missing persons and unsolved crimes. Some had names circled in red. At the center of the room, an old metal lockbox sat on a workbench, its lid slightly open. Inside, a USB drive and a faded handwritten note. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I never wanted to involve you, but now you have no choice. Trust no one. And whatever you do, don't go to the police. Not yet. Sophia's hands trembled as she picked up the USB drive. Her uncle had been involved in something dangerous. The room itself felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on her. She glanced over the documents again, her eyes scanning the circled names. One of them stood out, Melissa Carter. A missing woman. Sophia vaguely remembered seeing her face on the news months ago. One of those cases that made headlines for a few days before fading into the background. But why was her uncle tracking it? And why were there so many names? Her pulse pounded in her ears as she realized that this wasn't just about one missing person. It was a pattern. A network. And Robert had been digging into it. She shoved the USB into her pocket, grabbed a handful of documents, and hurried out of the hidden room, locking the office behind her. Back in her apartment, she plugged the USB into her laptop, half expecting nothing but a corrupt file. Instead, folders opened one by one, surveillance footage, financial transactions, transcripts of phone calls. It was overwhelming. One video, in particular, caught her eye, a grainy security camera feed showing Robert in the pawn shop, talking to a man in a dark suit. The audio was distorted, but one sentence sent a chill down her spine: she can't find out. If she does, we're all dead. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She can't find out. Were they talking about her? About someone else? She replayed the clip over and over, analyzing every frame. The man in the suit had his back to the camera, but his posture was tense, aggressive. Robert, on the other hand, looked exhausted, like a man who knew he was running out of time. Clicking through the folders, she found more footage. Meetings with different people. Transactions that didn't add up. And then, tucked away in a folder labeled Final Warning, a document listing offshore accounts linked to shell companies. Money laundering. Fraud. And something worse, connections to high-profile missing persons cases. Her uncle had been onto something massive. And now, so was she. A loud thud outside made her freeze. Her laptop screen cast a dim glow in the dark room as she listened, heart pounding. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, right outside her door. She quickly yanked the USB from her laptop and killed the screen. Silence. Then, a soft shuffle, like someone was pressing against the door, listening. Every hair on her body stood on end. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor. No one had any reason to be out there at this hour. She reached for her phone, but before she could dial, a notification flashed across the screen. Unknown number, stop digging. Sophia's stomach dropped. They knew. Someone was watching her, tracking her every move. She clenched the phone in her hand, her mind racing. Could they see her right now? Had they been in her apartment? She forced herself to breathe, to think. Running wasn't an option, not yet. She needed to understand what she was dealing with, who was behind this. Swallowing her fear, she grabbed her laptop, the USB, and a small bag. She wasn't staying here. If Robert was right about one thing, it was this: trust no one. She moved quickly, throwing on a hoodie and slipping out through the fire escape at the back of the building. The cold Chicago air hit her face, but she barely noticed. Every shadow felt like a threat, every car that passed made her flinch. She needed somewhere safe, somewhere no one would expect her to go. And then it hit her, the pawn shop. No one would think she'd go back. There. It was the last place anyone would look for her. But if Robert had hidden this much, maybe he had left her something else. Something to help her understand why she was in danger. The pawn shop was eerily silent when she slipped inside, locking the door behind her. The dim security light cast long shadows over the cluttered shelves, making everything feel distorted, surreal. Sophia's pulse was still racing as she moved through the store, heading straight for the back office. The secret room was exactly as she had left it, papers scattered, the lockbox still open. But something gnawed at her. Why had Robert chosen her? Of all people, why leave this to someone with no experience, no connection to whatever he was caught up in? There had to be a reason. Digging through the stacks of documents, she found something new, a faded family photo, tucked between the pages of an old ledger. Her uncle, much younger, stood beside a woman she didn't recognize. On the back, in Robert's messy handwriting, was a single word: Melissa. Sophia's breath hitched. Melissa Carter. The missing woman. But why would Robert have a photo with her? Who was she to him? And more importantly, what had happened to her? Sophia's fingers tightened around the photo as a wave of unease settled over her. Melissa wasn't just a random missing person, she was connected to Robert. But how? A past relationship? A business deal gone wrong? The more she tried to piece it together, the more questions piled up. She flipped through the ledger where she had found the picture, scanning the handwritten entries. It wasn't a financial record, it was a log. Dates, initials, addresses. Some names matched the circled ones from the newspaper clippings. Others were new. And then, near the bottom of the page, she saw it, her own name. The entry was dated 6 months before Robert's death. Next to it, a single note in shaky handwriting: she'll need to know the truth. Sophia's chest tightened. He had been planning this. Preparing her for something she didn't even know existed. But why? What did she have to do with any of this? Before she could process it, the sudden glare of headlights flooded through the pawn shop's front windows. A car had pulled up. A sleek black sedan, engine still running. Someone was here. Sophia ducked instinctively, pressing herself against the wall as the car idled outside. The pawn shop was supposed to be abandoned at this hour, no customers, no reason for anyone to be here. Her mind raced. Had they followed her? Had they been watching her all along? She barely dared to breathe as she peeked through the narrow gap between the shelves. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with an unsettling calm. He wasn't in a uniform. No badge, no sign he was law enforcement. But something about him screamed authority, the kind that didn't need a title to command fear. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He had a key. The front door clicked open, and Sophia's stomach twisted. Someone had given him access. She gripped the ledger in her hands, pulse hammering as she backed toward the secret room. She couldn't stay here. But where could she go? The fire escape was on the other side of the office, past where he was now stepping inside. His slow footsteps echoed against the wooden floor, measured and deliberate. He wasn't searching. He knew exactly what he was looking for. Sophia's mind was screaming at her to move, but she stayed frozen, gripping the ledger like it could somehow protect her. The man's footsteps grew closer, unhurried, methodical. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't checking random shelves or rifling through drawers. He knew. He knew where to go. He was heading straight for the office. Her breath caught as he stopped just outside the door, his shadow stretching across the floor. Then, a pause. A long, deliberate silence. Like he was listening. Like he could sense her there. She had seconds to decide. Fight. Hide. Her eyes darted to the hidden room, But she knew it was a trap. No way out. If he found her in there, she was done. The only option was to move now, before he committed to entering. Heart pounding, she slid her phone into her pocket, clutching the ledger tight. Then, she bolted. A desperate sprint toward the shop floor, toward the back exit. She didn't look back. Didn't dare. But behind her, she heard it, the sharp inhale of surprise, the scrape of a boot pivoting on wood, and then footsteps. Heavy. Fast. Coming for her. Sophia slammed into the back door, her fingers fumbling with the lock. Come on, come on. The heavy footsteps were closing in fast, each one sending a fresh jolt of panic through her body. Finally, the bolt slid free, and she stumbled into the alley. The cold night air burned her lungs, but she didn't stop, she couldn't. She sprinted down the narrow passage, dodging overflowing dumpsters and broken crates, her only goal, get away. Behind her, the door burst open. The man wasn't just following her. He was chasing her. Her legs burned as she pushed harder, rounding the corner onto the street. Taxis. Pedestrians. Lights. Safety. She spotted a cab idling near the curb and lunged toward it, yanking the door open. Drive, she gasped, barely able to force the word out. The driver blinked at her in confusion, but then, he saw the man. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Emerging from the alley like a shadow peeling away from the darkness. The driver didn't ask questions. The gas he hit. As the cab sped off, Sophia turned, her pulse still hammering. The man stood there, watching. Not running anymore. Not chasing. Just watching. And then, he smiled. Sophia's stomach twisted as she watched him shrink in the distance. His eerie smile burned into her mind. He wasn't worried. He wasn't panicked. That meant one thing, this wasn't over. She slumped back against the seat, her hands trembling as she clutched the ledger to her chest. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, eyes flicking between her and the road. You okay? He asked, his voice cautious. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. How could she explain what was happening when she barely understood it herself? Her mind was racing. He had a key. He knew where to go. That meant there was someone else. Someone who had access to Robert's pawn shop. Someone who had let him in. Someone she hadn't even considered yet. A fresh wave of nausea hit her as the realization settled in. This wasn't just about Robert's investigation anymore. Whoever was behind this, they knew about her. They had been expecting her. And the worst part? She had no idea who she could trust. Sophia forced herself to think. She needed a plan. Going back to her apartment was out of the question, they had already been there. The pawn shop was compromised. She had no idea how deep this went, but one thing was clear, they weren't just watching her, they were waiting for her to make a move. The cab weaved through Chicago's late-night traffic, the city lights blurring past her. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Who could she call? Who wouldn't sell her out? Every option felt like a trap. Instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She pulled up a random coffee shop on the map, one that was open 24 hours, and gave the driver the address. She needed time. A neutral place to sit, to go through the files, to figure out what Robert had left behind. As the cab rolled to a stop, she exhaled sharply. The streets were quiet, the shop nearly empty except for a barista and a few scattered customers. Safe. For now. She paid the driver, stepped out, and walked inside, every nerve in her body still on high alert. She wasn't running anymore, she was hunting for answers. Sophia settled into a corner booth, her back against the wall, eyes scanning the cafe. No one seemed to notice her, but paranoia gnawed at the edges of her mind. Had she really shaken him? Or was someone still watching? She pulled out her laptop, hesitating for a moment before plugging in the USB. If Robert had risked everything to leave this behind, there had to be something on it that explained why he was killed. File after file loaded onto the screen, spreadsheets, emails, surveillance footage. Some of the videos showed men in suits exchanging envelopes, people disappearing into black cars, faces blurred but recognizable enough. One folder, labeled Untouchables, made her stomach turn. Inside were documents linking names she recognized, CEOs, politicians, law enforcement officers. It wasn't just corruption. It was organized, systemic. Robert hadn't just stumbled onto a crime, he had uncovered a network. And now, they knew she had it. Sophia's pulse pounded as she scrolled through the names, her mind racing. These weren't just criminals. These were powerful people. People who could erase evidence, silence witnesses, make someone disappear without a trace. And Robert had been tracking them, documenting their every move. Had he been planning to expose them? Had he gotten too close? The files suggested he had spent years gathering this information, carefully piecing together how the network operated. But one question loomed over everything: why had he chosen her to inherit this? Then, she saw it. Her name. Buried in a list of persons of interest, next to Robert's. The note beside it was brief but chilling: she's connected. She doesn't know it yet. Sophia's breath hitched. Connected? How? She gripped the laptop, her hands shaking. Had Robert been protecting her from something all along? Had she been in danger before she even found the files? The realization sent a cold shiver down her spine. This wasn't just about Robert's past. It was about hers. Sophia's mind reeled. Connected? To what? To who? She scrolled through the files desperately, searching for anything that could explain what Robert had meant. Then, in a subfolder labeled Origins, she found something. That made her blood run cold: a scanned birth certificate. Her birth certificate. But something was off. The parents' names weren't the ones she had grown up with. The date was slightly different. And next to it, another document, a hospital record. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she pieced it together. She wasn't who she thought she was. Or at least, not entirely. Robert must have discovered something about her past, something tied to this network. Had she been adopted? Stolen? Was this why he had kept his distance all these years? She wanted to believe this was a mistake, but deep down, she knew. This was the reason he had chosen her. And the people who had just tried to kill her? They knew the truth before she did. Sophia's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her thoughts spiraling. If Robert had known this, then who else did? She clicked on another file, a scanned newspaper clipping, its edges yellowed with time. Infant girl missing from Chicago hospital, 1994. Her stomach twisted. The details matched the altered birth certificate. A newborn taken from the maternity ward, never found. The article mentioned frantic parents, a devastated family, an investigation that led nowhere. And then, another document, an adoption record. Except it wasn't official. It was forged. She pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to breathe. Was she that baby? Had her entire life been built on a lie? The realization was suffocating. If Robert had spent years unraveling this, it meant the people involved weren't just criminals. They were the kind of people who could steal a child, erase her past, and make sure no one ever found out. And if they were willing to kill to keep it buried, that meant one thing: she wasn't safe. She never had been. Sophia shut the laptop, her pulse hammering in her ears. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. She had spent her whole life believing she was just an ordinary woman, but now she was a loose thread in something monstrous. Robert must have uncovered it by accident, then spent years trying to trace it back. Had he planned to tell her? Had he known they would come for him before he had the chance? The weight of it all was crushing. The life she had known was gone. Every childhood memory, every family moment, it was all built on stolen time. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. Who could she even turn to? The police? Not an option. Robert's files showed law enforcement was compromised. Friends? They wouldn't believe her. She was alone. Completely alone. But if they thought she would just disappear, they were wrong. She wasn't going to run anymore. If Robert had risked everything to get her this information, it meant one thing: there was still a way to expose them. She just had to figure out how to do it before they got to her first. Sophia took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She needed to move carefully. If these people had been able to cover up a kidnapping for decades, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate one woman digging too deep. She reopened the laptop and copied the files onto a cloud drive. She couldn't risk losing them. Then, she pulled out a burner phone she had bought earlier that year for emergencies. She had never expected to actually need it. Now, it might be the only thing keeping her alive. She typed out a message and sent it to a number she hadn't dialed in years. An old journalist contact of Robert's, someone he had mentioned once in passing. Someone who had spent years investigating corruption, only to be blacklisted. If anyone would believe her, it was him. The message was simple: I have something you need to see. No cops. No names. Meet me tomorrow. As soon as it sent, she smashed the phone's SIM card and tossed it into a passing trash truck outside. No traces. No mistakes. This wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It was about surviving long enough to expose it. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, but Sophia knew she couldn't stop now. Tomorrow could change everything, or it could get her killed. She left the coffee shop, pulling her hood up as she walked down the dimly lit streets. Every passing car, every glance from a stranger made her skin crawl. Were they watching? Waiting? She had no way of knowing. She ducked into a cheap motel, paid in cash, and locked the door behind her. It wasn't much, but for now, it was safe. She spread the documents across the bed, forcing herself to absorb the details again. What was the missing link? Why had Robert waited so long to tell her? And why, after all these years, had they finally come after her? She needed to be ready. Tomorrow, she would meet Robert's contact, but she wasn't going in blind. She would find the missing piece herself. Because one thing was certain, this wasn't just about her past. It was about what came next. Sleep never came. Every time Sophia closed her eyes, flashes of the documents, Robert's warning, and the man with the key haunted her. She wasn't safe, not now, not ever. But fear wouldn't stop her. If Robert had died for this, she owed it to him to see it through. As the first hints of daylight crept through the motel window, she packed her things, stuffing the USB and ledger deep inside her jacket. Today was the day everything changed. One way or another. She took no chances, switching cabs twice before heading to the meeting spot, a rundown diner on the outskirts of the city. Neutral ground. Public enough to keep her from getting grabbed. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and fried eggs as she stepped inside. At a corner booth, a man in his 50s nursed a black coffee, his sharp eyes tracking her as she approached. The journalist. Robert's contact. The only person who might help her unravel this. But before she could sit, her phone buzzed. Unknown number, too late. A cold dread filled her. Too late for what? Sophia's blood ran cold. She clenched the phone, her pulse hammering as she tried to stay calm. Too late for what? She glanced around the diner, her instinct screaming that something was wrong. The journalist, who had been watching her closely, must have noticed the shift in her expression. Sit, he muttered under his breath, barely moving his lips. She slid into the booth, forcing herself to act normal. Robert sent you, didn't he? His voice was rough, tired. She nodded, swallowing the fear rising in her throat. If he was nervous, then she had every reason to be. Before she could say a word, he slid a folded napkin across the table. On it, hastily scribbled in pen, were two words: "We're watched." Sophia's chest tightened. They were already here. Maybe in the diner, maybe watching from across the street, maybe waiting for her to make a mistake. She gritted her teeth, resisting the urge to turn and scan the room. Whoever sent that message wanted her to know she was running out of time. But she wasn't going to run. Not yet. She needed answers. And she needed them now. Sophia kept her hands steady as she reached for her coffee, playing along, acting as if nothing was wrong. The journalist leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever Robert found, it scared powerful people. You understand what that means? She nodded, keeping her face neutral. It meant there was no backing out. He exhaled, glancing toward the window. I've seen cases like this before. Whistleblowers, deep corruption, people disappearing overnight. But this is different. They don't just want to silence you. They want to erase you. Her stomach tightened. Erase. The word felt heavier than anything else she had heard so far. Robert had been killed for what he knew. If they were watching her, sending threats, breaking into her home, it meant they weren't sure how much she had uncovered. Yet. She leaned in, voice steady. Then I need to go public. His expression darkened. That's exactly what they expect you to do. He paused, then slid another folded piece of paper toward her. You don't go to the police. You don't go to the press. You go to him. Sophia unfolded the note. A name. A A single name. One she had never seen before. But if this man was her only shot at exposing the truth, she had no choice but to find him. Sophia stared at the name on the paper, her mind racing. Who was he? Why had Robert trusted this person over the police or the media? The journalist leaned back, his eyes scanning the diner again. If you want to make it out of this alive, you listen carefully, he said under his breath. This man, he used to be one of them. He knows how they work, how they cover their tracks. If anyone can help you take them down, it's him. Sophia clenched her jaw. Trusting a former insider? That felt like stepping into another trap. But what choice did she have? Before she could respond, the journalist's eyes sharpened. His whole body tensed. Sophia followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. A man in a dark suit had just walked in. Not the same one from the pawn shop, but the same type. Clean cut. Expensive shoes. Calculated movements. They had found her. The journalist moved fast, shoving the napkin into her hand. Go. Now. Sophia didn't hesitate. She grabbed her things, kept her head down, and slipped toward the back exit. If she wanted to survive, she had to disappear before they made her disappear first. Sophia pushed through the back door of the diner, her heart hammering. The cold Chicago air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop. Had seconds, maybe less. If that man was here, others were close. She ducked into the alley, weaving between dumpsters, forcing herself not to look back. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just move. She clutched the napkin in her fist, the name on it already burned into her mind. Whoever this man was, he was now her only shot at getting out of this alive. She reached the street and forced herself to walk, not run. Running meant attention. Running meant panic. A taxi was parked at the curb, the driver scrolling through his phone. She yanked the door open and slid in. Where to we? The driver asked, barely glancing at her. Sophia hesitated. Where? She didn't know this man's address. Just his name. But there was one place she could go, somewhere she could regroup, figure out her next step. She took a breath, steadying herself. Just drive, she said, keeping her voice calm. I'll tell you where to go. The driver shrugged and pulled into traffic. For now, she had bought herself time. But not much. Sophia kept her eyes on the side mirror, watching the streets blur past. No black sedans. No obvious tails. But she knew better than to think she was safe. She unfolded the napkin again, staring at the name. Elias Monroe. It meant nothing to her, but if Robert and the journalist both believed he was the key, she had to find him. She pulled out her phone, hesitating for a moment before searching the name. No social media. No recent records. But then, a hit. A decades-old article about a whistleblower inside a federal task force. She clicked on it, her pulse quickening. The article was brief, buried deep in an old government archive. Monroe had been an investigator. High-level corruption, money laundering, missing persons, all tied to the same network Robert had uncovered. But then, suddenly, he had disappeared. No follow-ups. No statements. Like he had been erased. Sophia clenched her jaw. Was he dead? In hiding? Would he even help her if she found him? None of it mattered. This man knew the truth. He was the only person left who could help her expose it. If she didn't find him first, the people chasing her definitely would. The taxi rolled to a stop outside a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. She couldn't go back to her apartment. Couldn't risk anywhere familiar. She paid the driver in cash and stepped out, pulling her hood up as she scanned the area. No black sedans. No one watching. For now. Inside, she booked a room under a fake name, paid up front, and locked the door the second she stepped inside. The walls were thin, the air stale, but it didn't matter. All she needed was time. She sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, staring at the name. Elias Monroe. If he had vanished from public records, there had to be a reason. Maybe he was dead. Maybe he was in hiding. Or maybe he didn't want to be found. She opened her laptop, bypassing her usual accounts, and started searching deeper. Government leaks. Underground forums. Old whistleblower. Reports. And finally, a lead. A recent classified ad, vague but familiar, looking for something lost? Sometimes, the past finds you first. No name. Just a number. Could it really be him? She exhaled, steadying herself. There was only one way to find out. Sophia hesitated before dialing the number, her fingers hovering over the keypad. If this was a trap, she was walking straight into it. But if she did nothing, she was just waiting for them to find her. She took a breath and pressed call. 1 ring. 2. 3. Just as she was about to hang up, a deep voice answered. Who gave you this number? No hello. No hesitation. Whoever he was already on guard. She forced her voice to stay steady. Robert. A beat of silence. Then, a slow exhale. If you're calling me, he's dead. His tone didn't carry surprise, just certainty. Sophia swallowed hard. He already knew. Meet me at Clark and 14th, he said, voice low. Went dead. 1 hour. No room for questions. If you're being followed, don't bother showing up. No time for doubt. The line. Sophia gripped the phone, her heart hammering. This was it. If Elias Monroe was real, if he could help, this might be her last chance to get ahead of whoever was hunting her. Sophia left the motel through the back entrance, blending into the early morning crowd. 1 hour. That's all she had. She ditched her phone in a storm drain, no more digital traces. If Monroe was legit, he wouldn't trust anyone who could be tracked. She took 2 buses and walked the last few blocks to Clark and 14th, keeping her head down, heart pounding with every step. If this was a setup, she wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. She arrived at the intersection, scanning the area. No one obvious. No black sedans. Just a quiet corner of the city, half lit by flickering streetlights. Then, she spotted him, a man in his late 50s, leaning against a rusted old sedan. Worn leather jacket. Sharp eyes that had seen too much. Elias Monroe. He didn't wave her over, didn't call out. Just watched. Waiting. Testing her. Sophia exhaled and stepped forward. This was her only chance. She had to take it. Monroe's eyes stayed locked on her as she approached, his posture unreadable. Sizing her up. Sophia stopped a few feet away, keeping her movements slow, controlled. You're late, he muttered, barely loud enough to hear. She didn't respond. This wasn't a conversation, it was an evaluation. After a tense beat, he nodded toward the car. Screamed at her not to. Every instinct. She didn't know this man. Didn't know if she was walking into another trap. But she also knew she was out of options. She slid into the passenger seat, gripping the ledger inside her jacket. The car smelled like old cigarettes and leather. Monroe got in beside her, started the engine, and pulled onto the road like they had all the time in the world. Robert should have burned those files, he muttered, eyes on the road. Sophia tensed. So he knew exactly what she had. She turned to him, forcing the question out. Then why did he leave them to me? Monroe exhaled through his nose. Because you were never supposed to exist. Her breath caught. He wasn't talking about the investigation. He was talking about her. Sophia's chest tightened. Never supposed to exist? The words hit harder than anything else she had uncovered. She stared at Monroe, waiting for him to explain, but he kept driving, his jaw set. Robert didn't just find corruption, he finally said. He found proof of something bigger. Something buried so deep that the people who built it don't even have names. He glanced at her, his eyes dark with something that almost looked like pity. And you? You're living proof of it. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Living proof of what? She thought she had been uncovering Robert's secrets, but the truth was, Robert had been uncovering hers. Everything she had known about herself, about her past, it had all been a cover. A carefully constructed lie. And now, the people behind it knew she was getting too close. Sophia turned to Monroe, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Then tell me, she said. What am I up against? Monroe sighed, pressing harder on the gas. The kind of people who don't make mistakes, he said. Except this time, they did. And now, they knew it.